Thank you for all coming to Railfest in 2023. This is what's called the core complex in Steamtown, and don't normally see quite this many locomotives here, especially not the diesel locomotives. So today is special with this setup. I'm with the Anthracite Railroads Historical Society since 1975. I'm one of the founders of the organization. My wife and my daughter are over here. They've been along on this ride since 1975. And she never bargained that we started a historical society that would be about producing a magazine and prints and taking normal photographs of things. And then along came 1986, and a proposal was floated by Tri-State Society that, hey, you want to buy a locomotive? The board of directors wondered what we would possibly do. But that locomotive turned out to be this locomotive right here, number 664. At the time, it was in Maine. It was a Bangor and Aroostook locomotive. And it's what's called a Model F3. The Bangor and Aroostook was one of the last operators of the F3 locomotive. And the two historical societies, Tri-State and the Anthracite Railroads Historical Society, recognized that they were significant to tell the story. A bunch of people that didn't know anything about locomotives wound up going to Maine and buying two locomotives. We bought 664. Tri-State chapter bought the 663, which is outside the core complex. You can see through there. They are sister locomotives to the Bangor Aroostook. They were built in 1948. And these locomotives tell a story. The streamlined locomotives were the engines which replaced steam locomotives. So, and these were built in what's called a modular format, because you had one engineer up front. They were plugged together electrically, and this is called an A unit. One of these without a cab, which you will see out there if you go out to see the other one, is called a B unit. And EMD, the builder, Electromotive Division of General Motors, marketed these as 1,500 horsepower modules. So you could plug two together and get 3,000 horsepower, plug three together, get 4,500, and plug four, get 6,000 horsepower. This was a big advantage over steam locomotives, which required a crew and a fireman in every locomotive. So we had, that was the advantage the railroad saw, besides the advantage of less costly fuel and servicing. 1986, the ARHS and Tri-State bought these two locomotives. The one out there, 663, was an operating locomotive on the Bangor and Aroostook. It was just retired and it was purchased by Tri-State. This one was an empty, this one was an empty shell. There was nothing in the inside. It was just the outside that you see here was all that was there. The cab was intact. There was no motor. There was no generator. There was nothing else inside. Because this is a one-direction locomotive, generally only, it can run in both directions, but you can only see going forward. So the pair was always anticipated that the pair was going to stay together, put back to back, and that way it would be functional. This one, because it didn't have anything inside of it, we were going to just make what's called a cab control. And people came up to me at the time and said, oh, that one will never run again. I take a challenge when people say that. One thing has led to another. This is a fully functional locomotive today. and next week it will run out on an excursion to Delaware Water Gap. It has been functional for a good number of years. We have been at Steamtown since 2010. Before that, we had these locomotives down in Jim Thorpe. We put this together as a bunch of amateurs. I had a couple chemists, bankers, business people, and we asked a lot of questions and found the railroad industry to be very helpful in giving suggestions. And we purchased various parts and wound up putting it all back together. And we're very proud of that. This locomotive was built, as I said, in 1948. It's of the era that, if you're familiar with your cars from that time period, it reflects the same time period of the rounded curves that were common in the 1950s and 40s. It shares, because it's a General Motor locomotive, it shares parts such as the window mechanisms and the vent windows that you would have. In this case, these windows came from a 1937 Buick. That was where the mechanisms came from. We didn't literally take them from there. But so GM borrowed things from their automotive division to make this locomotive. These were highly successful. And over the course of the 1950s, steam disappeared. Now, the organization, as far as the ARHS, went on to decide that if one or two is fine, we need to have the middle, to tell the story, we need the middle one as well. So the B unit that's out there came along after the fact. We're presently in the process of making that one operational, and hopefully later this year, both will be functioning on a train trip out of here. Now, what I want to talk about is we've got another one sitting right alongside here, probably one that many of you came to see, the PA, which is an Alco product. This is the difference. The look at the two of them is the difference between the appearance of an Alco locomotive and a General Motors locomotive. It's also the difference between a passenger locomotive, which is what the 190 is, it's sitting on 6 axles, and the freight locomotive, which is the F unit, sitting on 4 axles. The freight locomotive, because the PA over there, although it's on 6 axles, all the axles are not powered. The middle axle is just an idler. So the freight locomotive with the 4 axles has more weight on drivers, therefore it can pull more than the larger passenger locomotive. Passenger locomotive is designed for speed. Those long trucks allowed it to be a much smoother ride when pulling a passenger train at 100 miles an hour. This locomotive, 664, normal freight gearing, which is what it has in it, is 65 miles an hour per tops. So there's a drastic difference, and I welcome all of you to walk around and take a look at the differences between them. The Anthracite Railroad's Historical Society, to this day, we have a relationship with the Park Service. Since 2010, we are a partner, and we keep our locomotives here at the park, and the park uses them. We have volunteers. We work generally any Saturday on all kinds of projects. As any of you know who have other hobbies, as far as whether you have antique cars of your own or boats or whatever it may be, you're never done. They always require work. And considering that the 664 has been regularly in service here at Steamtown since 2012, she has made many trips up and down the railroad, down to Delaware Water Gap and back. And our group of volunteers keeps it running, even though she's a legitimate antique. According to the FRA, this locomotive is not required to have some of the requirements that current new locomotives are, such as ditch lights on the front, because she's too old and not required. My volunteers here in the shop, the benefit that the park offered us to come up here was that they would get exercise to run, and we'd get the use of the shop and the facilities. If any of you today get the chance to go through the shop, you'll know overhead cranes and a drop table, all of which were designed for working on diesel locomotives. This shop is specifically, when the Lackawanna Railroad bought these F units, they went back to General Motors and said, how do we maintain these? Because they had only worked on steam engines before. And General Motors, knowing that all the railroads that they were selling these new pieces of equipment to had a set of plans drawn up saying, this is the shop facilities you need to build to properly maintain our locomotives. This shop that is here is one of EMD's so-called, one of EMD's shops. It was designed according to those blueprints. The main steam shop here in Scranton for the Lackawanna is across this Washington Avenue and is currently used by the government for making shells. But that was where the steam engines really were. This shop here is was Lackawanna's diesel shop. So we are very fortunate that the deal, it's unbelievable to be able to work in a shop that has these facilities. To work on various things on this locomotive, you've got a V16 inside here, which has 567 cubic inches per cylinder. It is infinitely repairable because the block is a fabricated block and the liners are dropped down through the fabrication. If there's a problem in one cylinder, you pull the roof off of this locomotive, and then you, with a crane, can pull out one cylinder or power assembly at a time, replace it, put it back together, and keep going. This engine parts are still available. This engine was in production as originally a 567 up until, from 1939 until 1965. So it had a very long run, which means there are a lot of parts that are still available for it. Today, they have expanded the displacement on the engine. It's up to 710 cubic inches per cylinder in the new diesels. But the overall structure of the locomotive and the design of it still dates back to 1939. I don't know what else other people know about these. You are not dealing with a mechanical transmission device here. These are called diesel electric locomotives. All of them are, because your transmission is through an electric generator. The diesel drives the generator and then produces about 600 nominal volts out to drive electric motors, which are hanging on every axle. And by that means, you can overload the electric motors and get the train started and then notch it back. This engine, just as information, this engine will idle at 200 RPMs. It has 8 notches in it. When you're in 8th notch full speed, we'll be rotating at 800 RPMs. Not a very fast engine compared to your automobile. So, if anybody is interested in the ARHS, we've got people here today. If anybody's interested, would like to get their hands dirty and come and volunteer to help work on these things on Saturdays, contact me. Anybody have any questions?
I bored everybody.
Okay.